I'm Catherine Brown. I'm a glass and ceramic artist. I use a number of processes in my work, one of which is screen printing. So today I'm going to show you that process and how that's incorporated into my work. So before we can do any printing, we need to generate our imagery, and this is probably one of the most important parts of screen printing, because without decent imagery you're not going to get a decent screen to work from, and therefore you won't get a decent print. So you can generate imagery in a number of ways, the basics of it being that your image needs to be black and white. And the way that the exposure unit works is that wherever the black is within the image is where the light will be blocked as the UV comes through, and therefore the emulsion will stay soft, and therefore you will have your stencil. So wherever there's a black line, or wherever there's black on your image, that is where your ink will be when you print. And that's quite important to remember when you're creating your imagery, because obviously that's going to affect your choices as you develop your work. We've got some examples here of some positives and some negatives, sort of reverse imagery, just to show you the different types of thing that you could look at. We've also then got a range of imagery which is both digital and hand generated. You can use found objects, as I do on the exposure units, just by laying them on, but you can also produce imagery using Photoshop, Illustrator or any other digital means, so long as your image is black and white. If you are producing digital work, it will need to be printed on this special Folex paper, which basically is a good quality tracing paper which absorbs the black ink really well and gives you a really good quality black image. The reason for the tracing paper then is making sure that the light goes through the rest of the imagery, only blocking out where the black areas are. If you've got an image on cartridge paper or a solid paper, you are able to oil it using vegetable oil, and that will then let the light go through again, so allowing your black image to block out, but the light to permeate through the image and create your stencil. Some of the students also experiment with cutting up their imagery and collaging and laying it straight onto the exposure unit, so that's quite a fun thing to do, which allows you to be quite creative and almost create a sample screen, if you like, of lots of different effects. But what is most important for anybody that's screen printing onto glass is just to remember the qualities and the effects that you want that maybe cannot be replicated using other processes. For myself, I'm interested in using these threads and these kind of natural, spontaneous lines that work on the exposure unit, and I'm interested in using it in conjunction with the sandblasting. So I've altered the surface of the glass here slightly to try and get the illusion that the screen printed line is running through the glass, almost kind of the threads are sort of sewn through the glass. So that's kind of what I'm working with, but it tends to be in conjunction with something else, rather than it just being a straight image. You can use it with other processes, so I just see it as a starting point almost to get your imagery onto glass. Okay. So the first job, whilst we're preparing for screen printing, is to coat the screen. Now I've got a nice clean screen here. They come in various meshes, so it's important to make sure that you use the right mesh for the job. When you're using glass enamels, it's advisable to use a 77 mesh. 77 there, but for other purposes you might have a higher grade mesh, which would be much finer for graphic design or paper-based things. But for the powders, for the enamels to go through the mesh, it needs to be a 77 ideally, and that gives us quite a nice lot of detail. So the mesh is stretched across the frame, obviously, so it is taut, so it is delicate, so you need to be careful with it, and obviously no sharp objects near it, and nice and clean and ready to go. So what we're going to do then is we're going to apply a thin layer of light sensitive emulsion to the screen to enable us to get our imagery on. And that is this pot of emulsion here. So we're going to keep the lid on for a minute because obviously we're in a light environment. It's light sensitive, so therefore when we apply it to the screen we need to make sure that we're in a dimmed environment and there isn't any UV light around. It doesn't have to be completely pitch black, but we need to be aware of it as we're coating the screen. This is a coating trough, which is what we're going to be using. It's got these little sides on to enable us to wash it, and it's a metal tray with a lovely soft rounded edge. Really important that we keep this rounded edge clean and free from drips and drizzles of emulsion or any skags or scratches, because when we coat the screen, obviously any of those marks are going to show up in the coating. So we squeeze on the sides, making sure they're as secure as we can. We lay our tray out. I'm going to turn the light off so that we've got a dimmed light to allow us to open our emulsion. It doesn't need stirring because we don't want any bubbles in it, and we're just going to pour plenty of emulsion into the trough so we've got enough to cover our screen, and we're going to put the lid back on. Okay, now we're going to just, because you can see it's quite thick and gloopy, and we're just going to make sure that we, as evenly as we can, get it to the edge of the coating tray. And when we're ready to go, we're going to hold it against the bottom. Okay. So we're aiming for a nice thin, even coverage, with no marks on the coating at all, and that goes straight into the dark drying cupboard to protect it from the light and to dry off the emulsion, ready to expose it. Okay, so we're ready to expose our screen now. So this is the exposure unit, which basically exposes UV light to your light sensitive emulsion, hardens the emulsion wherever your image isn't, and therefore creates your detailed stencil onto your screen. In my case, we're using black thread, which is my found object, although obviously you can use digital imagery or hand-drawn imagery, anything black basically that's going to block the light out and create your image. So I'm going to get the screen. So we're going to take it out. Notice that we haven't got any bright lights on because this emulsion is still light sensitive. And we're going to take it across to the exposure unit and arrange it with our image. So basically this is now being exposed to UV light. As you can see, the back former at the top of the exposure unit has pulled down. What that's doing is making sure that the surface of the mesh is tight against the glass and that there's no light getting in from anywhere else. This exposure unit will take about 8 minutes to expose, but depending on the strength of the UV bulbs, they can be anything from 30 seconds up to longer. So that's just something that's sort of individual to each exposure unit. And when that's completed, we'll take it to the wash area and we'll wash the soft emulsion away to reveal the see there where the image is turned yellow rather than this pale green colour. That means that obviously the image is returned to the mesh colour, which means the mesh is clear and therefore we'll be able to print through that. So we need to make sure that the whole image is really clean and there isn't any soft emulsion left in there. That then needs to dry before we're able to print with it. That can dry naturally or within the drying cabinet, whatever facilities you have, and then you're ready to print. So the next job is to mix the enamels, and we're going to use glass enamel, apply it onto the surface of the glass and then kiln fire it so that it's permanent onto the surface of the glass. There's a huge array of enamels that you can use. They can be opaque or transparent, high firing, low firing, Any of them work with the screen print medium that we're using. So basically, in effect, what we're doing is we're adding the coloured powder, the coloured glass enamel, to the screen print medium in order to make it the right consistency to put it through the mesh and make sure that we get a nice print. The screen print medium is water based, so you don't need to worry too much about how you wash it out or anything like that. In days gone by it was all kind of solvent based, but it is water based. It gives a really nice creamy consistency, and what it does then is it makes sure that you get a nice thin coverage of enamel from your screen print. It also dries quite hard, which is a really good quality, because it means then that you can do other things with your print. You can let it dry and then scratch into it, or you can work with it in different ways before you fire the image, so it allows you to be quite creative. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a colour. We've got a little weighing scales here and a clean jar, and we're going to weigh out the enamel and the screen print medium in the ratio of 10 parts enamel to 4 parts screen print medium. That ratio can be changed as well. I'm just going to put my mask on because obviously we're working with hazardous materials. So I've used here 100 grams of enamel to 40 grams screen print medium, and then that needs a really good stir, and I mean a really good stir, not just by hand with a spoon like this, because as you can see there's a lot of texture in there. We're dealing with powders, and enamel is kind of can be quite gritty in a way, and in order to get that powder smooth enough to go through the fine mesh, we need to make sure it's really well mixed. So we use an electric mixer, or put it on the pillar drill for about 20 minutes, half an hour, to make sure all that texture is gone. If you haven't got that electric mixer, then you're doing it by hand, it's a good idea to mix it the night before, let it soak, because it seems to dissolve quite well, and then that makes it a bit easier to mix in. But you obviously can't have any kind of texture in there, otherwise it's not going to go through the mesh properly. So that will be mixed now, and then we'll be ready to go. Okay, so before we start printing, we need to prepare our glass. Whatever glass it is that you want to print onto, you need to make sure that it's clean, and more importantly that we've got these sharp edges taken away, because we don't want anything sharp near our mesh that's obviously going to cause holes and damage our mesh. So I'm just going to use a hand sander here to different wet processes, just to take those really sharp edges off the glass. Okay, and then obviously we need to make sure that the glass is really clean and dry. We don't want any water on there. Okay. So we're going to be using the screen print table to print the glass. Obviously these screen print tables are designed for paper, so they've got these little vac holes in that you can turn the vac on, and then basically obviously the paper sets down. Obviously you can't do that with glass, so we're just going to use it without the vac, but it is still useful to have your hands free obviously with the frame that holds the screen. So just put a piece of scrap paper underneath to catch any ink that falls off the screen. I'm also going to put another sheet of paper on the bed of the screen print table that's the same size as my piece of glass but a different colour. And the reason for that is when you put your glass on, because it's transparent, obviously it's quite difficult to see where the glass is underneath your screen. So by putting a different colour underneath it, you're just able to identify the edges of your glass more easily and line up your image. So we're now ready to fix our screen onto the screen print table. And we're aiming for the mesh to be just a couple of millimetres higher than the level of the material that you're going to print onto. So when you push your finger down, you just need to have that little bit of pressure there. Obviously, depending on the thickness of the material that you're working on will depend on the level of the screen. If you're working on thicker, sort of 10mm glass or something like that, it's useful to put some buffer pieces to the side as well, so your screen isn't forced into a position where it might break. So we're aiming for a nice level surface that's just a couple of millimetres off the surface of the glass that you want to print onto. We can then obviously line up your glass in relation to your image, depending on where you want your image to print compositionally. So you can decide that from just sort of playing around with where your glass is in relation to the imagery that you've got. And the black paper obviously helps you to line that up. And when you're happy with where your image is, and where your screen is, and where your glass is, then we're ready to apply some enamel. Okay, so our screen's set up with our glass and we know exactly what we want to print. Now we're ready to use our enamels. Obviously we mixed the green earlier, but I'm going to actually print in black because I tend to use mostly black and white in my work. So we'll just put that one in there. We need to then locate a squeegee, which is the piece of equipment that we use to push the enamel through the mesh. Now again, there's a variety of squeegees that you can obtain, varying in kind of like flexibility, if you like, depending on how you like to print. This one's a kind of medium flexibility, and we're doing a visual check to just make sure again that there are no nicks out of the edge of the squeegee and that it's nice and clean, because any kind of mark on that surface will come out on your print, and obviously we don't want any marks that are going to spoil our image. We've got some black enamel that's already mixed up and ready to go. So we're going to be quite generous with our enamel and put plenty at the top of the image and at the top of the glass. Then with our squeegee, we're going to just very gently pull the enamel through the mesh. So we're not actually printing at the moment. What we're doing is we're charging the mesh with the enamel to make sure that there's plenty of enamel in the mesh. And then when we're ready to print, we're going to hold our squeegee at 45 degrees. We're going to press down so that the screen makes contact with the glass, and we're going to push the enamel firmly through. Do that one more time just to make sure. And then we'll be able to see our print. Okay, so this is our print. Nice thing about glass is you can hold it up to the light and really see the detail. You can see it's picked up all the lovely delicate threads, which is what we were wanting. Something that would be very difficult to replicate in another technique. That's ready to fire now. These enamels will fire at around 600 to 650 degrees. It'll go straight into the kiln, and that'll become permanent onto the glass. Okay, so once you've finished our print, we then need to rescue any excess enamel that we can from the mesh using a soft implement like a plastic spoon or a wooden spoon. Don't use anything sharp because again we don't want to damage our mesh, but we also need to preserve our enamel because it is quite expensive. So we're going to take the excess enamel off, and then that mesh must be washed through with a hose, a power hose, as quickly as possible, because the enamel sets in the mesh and obviously that will damage it as well. So that's one of the first jobs after we've printed our image. Okay, so this then needs to be fired at around about 600, 650 degrees, as you would for your normal enamels. And then that's permanent on the glass. Obviously, you've got the opportunity then to reprint, layer images, add other things to it, other techniques. So, kind of the start of a creative journey. So this is my work that incorporates screen printing into alongside other techniques to do with kiln forming and sandblasting. Hopefully from the demonstration that you had earlier, you'll see the huge potential that the technique has in being able to translate your imagery into glasswork and then use it in a variety of different ways. And hopefully the demonstration's inspired you to try out a few different things.